Good morning and good afternoon. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from my home in Victoria on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen peoples, also known as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. I extend my appreciation for the opportunity to live, work, play, and learn and create on this territory. I would also like to extend my congratulations to all of the doctoral students and the faculty members on your papers and presentations over the last 2 days. I'd like to congratulate Hassan, Mary, Kim, Carolyn, all the others for putting this conference together. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Thomas Homer-Dixon. He's the director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University, and he holds a university research chair in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo. He was the founding director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation, and prior to that, the director of the Trudeau Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Toronto. Born here in Victoria, he received his BA in political science from Carleton University in 1980, and his PhD from MIT in 1989. He studies how people, organizations, and societies can better resolve their conflicts and innovate in response to complex problems. His work is highly interdisciplinary, drawing on political science, economics, environmental studies, geography, cognitive science, social psychology, and complex systems theory. His academic writing has appeared in leading academic journals, and his non-academic audiences have seen his work in publications like Foreign Policy, Scientific American, the New York Times, the Financial Times, and he now writes regularly for the Globe and Mail. Dr. Homer-Dixon's books include Environment, Scarcity, and Violence, which won the 2000 Caldwell Prize of the American Political Science Association, The Ingenuity Gap, which won the 2001 Governor General's Nonfiction Award, and The Upside of Down, which won Canada's 2006 National Business Book Award. His most recent book is Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. In it, he calls on his knowledge of complexity science, of how societies work and can evolve, and our capacity to handle threats, to show that we can shift human civilization onto a decisively new path if we mobilize our minds, spirits, imaginations, and collective values. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Homer-Dixon. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And it's marvelous to be with you today. I have to say that when I was invited to speak at this conference many months ago, I was really excited about the possibility, because all my research through my entire career has been socially engaged, has been focused on trying to improve the world and understand how the world works better so that we can increase our leverage, our possibilities for improving the world and having a more positive future. Now, I understand that the conference so far has been enormously successful, and congratulations to everyone, the organizers and the participants. I'm afraid I haven't been able to join you up to this point, but I wanted to speak today a bit about the issue of hope and the relationship between the state of our world and hope and socially engaged research, because I think those are really important connections that need to be explored. Now, I don't think you need to be watching the news on a minute-by-minute basis to have a sense that the world is in a mess, basically. There are an extraordinary range of challenges facing our individual societies and humankind as a whole, any one of which could be potentially a deal breaker for a positive future. But combined, they seem to be sometimes simply overwhelming. And I think one of our reasonable reactions to this kind of environment, political, social, economic environment around us, is to just throw up our hands and walk away and say, there's nothing I can do about it. These problems are so large and I'm so small that there's really very little I can do. And the burden of my presentation today is saying that I really don't believe that's the case. That various kinds of activism or socially engaged research can contribute to a sense of positive possibility and hope for the future. And at the same time, that hope can motivate us to be socially engaged and activists in trying to produce a better world. So there's a kind of feedback loop, a reciprocal relationship between the activism and the hope that I think is really important. And when I say activism, I don't necessarily mean being out on the streets with a picket sign up at Ferry Creek trying to stop old growth logging or whatever. I mean, maybe that's your thing, perhaps it isn't. What I mean really is facing the problems that we are dealing with at a global level head on and figuring out where your niche is in terms of your response. And figuring that out can give you a sense of hope, and that hope can empower you to do more and be more successful in your activism. And at the center of that feedback loop is this idea of agency, the sense of personal free will and possibility we have to actually change our world for the better. So those are some of the things I'm going to talk about. I want to, before I jump into my slides, I want to say a little bit about the fact that it really is a daunting situation that we face. And I'll talk more about that in a bit of detail in a moment with some statistics and data. But there is a role for everyone in this situation. I tell my audiences frequently, and I speak to a very broad range of people, that it doesn't matter whether you're an engineer or a nurse or a construction worker or a horticulturalist or a teacher or an artist or an accountant. There is a demand for your expertise to address the challenges we face. The world is going through a very rapid process of reconfiguration and restructuring, most fundamentally around our energy production systems, but also in terms of our social relations. And we can all play a role in trying to make that pathway a route to a positive future. And so don't think that this is too big for you, that there's too much happening and that we're all so small and the problems are so big. Collectively, if we choose to, we can make the difference that's needed. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to jump into my slides. I have a presentation that hits at sort of a general level, talking about some of the issues I've just introduced. And then if I have a few minutes, and I'm keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to just review some of my latest thinking about the challenges we face, which is a little bit more analytical, a little bit more theoretical, but I think is quite interesting, and it'll give you a sense for where I am right at the moment in terms of how I'm approaching these issues. And I hope we can leave lots of time for conversation and discussion before noon, because I don't actually really learn very much by listening to myself, but I always learn an enormous amount by having a conversation with others. So with that as background, let me bring up the slides. Now, I just would like a confirmation, perhaps, Robert, you could just let me know that you can see those, okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Great, thank you so much. So that's the title of my presentation, and I really do think that what we're facing here is a matter of finding the balance between a sense of knowledge and understanding of the challenges we face and the hope that we create in response to those challenges to address them effectively. Now, I seem to have a little problem with my screen here. I'm going to kill this live transcription notice, and I hope that doesn't seem to cut me off, which is great. Now I can see my screen properly. This is the book Robert mentioned at the end of his intro. I published it just under a year ago. It really contains my most recent thinking about all of the issues that we're going to address today. This is not a pitch, but it's telling you where these ideas are coming from. And everything that I'm talking about today is in one respect or the other discussed within this book. I seem to have a little problem here with, there we go. So as Robert mentioned in his introduction, I'm from originally Vancouver Island. This is where I grew up. I went out east for 4 decades to the United States and built my professional career in Ontario at the University of Toronto and the University of Waterloo. And have recently returned with my family. Professionally, I'm now running the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But the point of this photograph, which is actually taken from our house in Machosen, standing on the cliff, looking over Perry Bay, and those are the Olympic Mountains in Washington State in the distance. This is a property that's been in our family since the 1970s. Is that this landscape, and many of you will be quite familiar with it, I imagine, is really in my bones. This is a deep part of who I am and how I react to the world. In particular, the natural environment here. There's a much stronger connection on the west coast of Canada, and especially on Vancouver Island, with the natural environment than there is, for instance, in Ontario. And that is reflected in the cultural evolution on the west coast of North America, especially, for instance, the much more vigorous support, for instance, for the Green Party here in British Columbia, and especially on Vancouver Island. This is a photograph taken in 2012, just up the coast from our property. So this is south of Jordan River, a little beach that I've been going to for, the last 60 years or so. That's our son, Ben. Sarah Wolf is my partner and wife, and that's our son, Ben, standing on the beach, holding my hand, and he was about 7 at the time, and Kate on my shoulders was about 4. They're now 16 and 13 respectively. And I have to say that one of my principal motivations over the last 10 years, for instance, in writing the book Commanding Hope, has been to address the issue of what their future is going to be like and how they should engage with that future. As they have emerged from the age you see here to the age they are now, they have started to realize what's going on in the world, and they become informed about everything from climate change to Donald Trump to other changes in the natural environment, and of course the pandemic. And they're, needless to say, very worried about what this means for their future, even though Sarah and I try to reassure them a great deal. And I think every parent now faces exactly the same kind of challenge. Parent of young children, of adolescents, faces exactly the same kind of challenge in trying to represent for our children a future that's worth living in and where they have a place of positive possibility. And that's a real challenge because, frankly, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the world does seem to be going haywire. There are a host of problems every direction we look, it seems. And I'm not going to belabor these in great detail because we're all familiar with them, but I am going to talk a little bit in more detail about climate change in a moment, because that's the issue I've been working on for almost 40 years. But when we look around, of course, we have the pandemic, which just doesn't seem to go away. We seem to be going into a 4th wave here. The world is getting a real world, real-time lesson in the power of biological evolution with the development of new variants of concern, which have changed the risk profile of the pandemic dramatically just in the last few months. And it's, of course, produced extraordinary disruption as well as absolutely unfathomable hardship around the world, especially in poor countries with weaker institutions and less robust health facilities and health institutions. We've seen an upsurge in concern coincident with the pandemic about systemic racism and deep structural inequalities in our society that's produced mass protests, especially last summer. And it's not a surprise, really, that these protests and concerns arose at the same time as the pandemic, because the pandemic has hypercharged or accelerated the rise of inequality around the world. Some societies and some groups within societies have been able to adapt really quite well, and it hasn't disturbed their livelihoods or patterns of living very much, whereas other people have been desperately affected. And this has tended to widen the gaps between rich and poor, between powerful and weak around the world. There are mass migrations. The United Nations says that the largest migrations in human history or in recorded history are starting to take place right now. There are about 70 million refugees in the world, which is the largest number outside of major wars ever recorded by the United Nations. These movements of people tend to stimulate very harsh reactions on the part of receiving societies. Probably the single factor that stimulates the rise of populist nationalism and right-wing reactionary politics within societies is the arrival of large numbers of migrants from outside the society's borders. Simultaneously, we're seeing a decline in the strength of democracies around the world. Quite striking change. In fact, these data, which were produced by The Economist in 2020, are now probably would need to be updated, and line would need to be extended even further downwards with, for instance, the weakening of democracy in Tunisia and South Africa, and of course in Cambodia and Myanmar, extraordinary moves towards authoritarianism in those societies. Closer to home, we've seen over the last many years, now 5 or 6 years in British Columbia, the effects of climate change really vivid and real in our everyday lives. Not just in British Columbia, but perhaps it's been the part of Canada that's been most affected. In 2015, 2017, 2018, 2020, so in 4 of the 6 years up to this year, there were massive smoke events on the west coast of North America, saturating Vancouver Island and Vancouver and as far south as Seattle, with smoke so dense that visibility dropped to just a couple hundred meters. These are unheard of, unseen, unprecedented events going back a century or more. So something really is changing here. Here's the smoke that gathered last September on the west coast from the fires in Oregon and California especially. You see that it was sucked out into the Pacific in a huge vortex, but covered most of the west coast of North America. And then as the winds changed and blew west across the continent, blew towards the east, the westerly winds blew towards the east across the continent, this massive smoke was pushed entirely across the continent and extended out into the Atlantic and over Europe, which just goes to show that these problems know no boundaries. And I'll come back to this point in a few minutes, that we are really very much in the same boat around the planet anymore. Some of us may be able to protect ourselves for a little while against some of the immediate effects, but over the long run, there's a very significant problem of shared fate, or situation of shared fate, that we now face on this planet. We either solve these problems together, or we experience them and decline and perhaps end up fighting each other together. So let me say a little bit more about climate change, because as I said, this is the issue that I have focused on in my research for the last 30 or 40 years, from the very early days of it becoming an issue in research and public policy in the 1980s. There are 2 charts that haunt me, and this is one of them, 2 graphs that I think about all the time. This one I created myself out of data available from the publicly available research data. It shows the change in temperature at the surface of the planet going back to 11,300 years ago. That was the end of the last ice age. This is called the Holocene epoch, basically the interglacial period, the most recent interglacial period. And it comes up to the present, as you can see on the right-hand side. And there's a variation in the temperature of the surface of the planet, the tropospheric temperature of around 0.7 degrees Celsius. And in the last 2,000 years on the right there, the period during which humankind created the infrastructure of modern human civilization, laid down its population centers, its major population centers, its agricultural networks, its irrigation systems, its transportation systems, and the like. During that 2,000 years, the temperature has varied about 0.5 degrees Celsius. And now you can see that even with the warming to date, we are now well outside that, that envelope of temperatures. And if we continue along what is called a business as usual trajectory with emissions that we are dumping into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases, at the moment, we will head towards 3 degrees Celsius warming towards the end of this century. Now, there are some real questions as to whether humankind can adapt to even 2 degrees Celsius warming, but at 3 degrees Celsius, it's very unlikely that, for instance, global food systems will be robust enough to feed the projected 10 billion people on the planet. It's also really unlikely, frankly, that circumstances will be able to sustain what we regard as liberal democracy now, the basic freedoms and prosperity that we've come to know within our societies. And this is within a really short period of time. As we start to approach 3 degrees Celsius, significant swaths of the planet are going to start to become uninhabitable for some parts of the year because their temperature outdoors will exceed what specialists call a 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. So this is basically 35 degrees with 100% humidity. At that point, human beings can't sweat away heat fast enough to survive outdoors. And there will be significant areas of the planet, including the Gangetic Basin, some parts of Africa, big areas of the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, for example, where you won't be able to survive outdoors at those temperatures. And that will induce in huge migrations, perhaps hundreds of millions or more of people to places that are cooler on the planet. That's not a prescription for a stable global society. And I look at this and I think about my children and I think this is a future that simply must not come to pass. We have to do everything we can to prevent it. And that brings us to the second graph, the second chart, which haunts me. And this is the famous Keeling curve, named after a famous atmospheric researcher by the name of Keeling at the Scripps Oceanographic Institute in California. And this is a measurement of cycles of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere going back to the late 1950s at Mauna Loa Observatory in the Hawaiian Islands. And the sawtooth phenomenon you're seeing there is the cycle of absorption and emission of carbon dioxide, natural biological cycle that occurs in the northern hemisphere every year as you absorb carbon dioxide through the photosynthetic process, as plants, especially deciduous trees, absorb a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as they grow, and then as the fall comes, they lose their leaves and the carbon dioxide re-enters the atmosphere. And so it cycles up and down. But the critical thing is the long-term trend, which frankly is exponential. And probably what you're noticing there is that it seems to be kind of inexorably increasing. In fact, there's not a single time really, except perhaps with a brief pause in the early 1990s, where this curve seems to have started to bend downwards. And this is the fundamental challenge we face. Everything we've done so far, all of the discussion around climate change issues, all of the investment in green energy, ESG and sustainability has done nothing so far to substantially alter the trajectory of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And it suggests that we have to do not only a lot more, but probably fundamentally reconfigure our economies and our social relations if we're going to start to bend this curve down. And if we don't bend this curve down, that's where we end up. And that is the end of our world as we know it. There isn't a single ecosystem on the planet that can withstand a temperature increase of 3 degrees Celsius. All of the forests that we know in British Columbia will die and quite possibly burn in a world of 3 degrees Celsius warmer. We can't go there, which means we have to move this curve downwards, and everything we're doing up to this point is not working, or is not sufficient, is not enough. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. So where does this leave us? I mean, it scares the hell out of me, and it probably scares you too. I think the dominant emotion this kind of situation generates for us is fear. And fear is a useful emotion. There's a reason that we evolved it as a species. There's a reason why animals have a fear response to their environments, is because it stimulates them to protect themselves, to run, or perhaps to fight, but to respond to an imminent danger. But too much fear can cause a number of pernicious results. It can cause us to shut down, to not pay attention, to run away, to try to hide from the problems, to just say, well, it's not so bad. Really, this is just a bunch of doomsayers trying to make us uncomfortable, trying to make a lot of money through speeches or research grants. But unfortunately, now the facts of the matter are that justifies a significant amount of fear. Another thing that can happen, though, when fear is not managed effectively and not channeled into positive outcomes, is that it can provide the social and social psychological and political basis for a dramatic shift in our political institutions and in the politics of our societies. The rise of demagogues and others who take advantage of fear in order to build their own political power, consolidate their base, and divide us against each other. It's an absolutely certain way that we will ultimately not solve these problems if we go down this pathway. And of course, there are many groups around the world who are responding to these situations that I've described and to these fundamental pressures and challenges that our societies face with this kind of angry, divisive response that is profoundly impregnated with fear and anger in a sense of grievous injustice. So is this where we are? Is this what we're going to come to believe and tell our children as the future unfolds over the next years? And I think if that's the case, we are in for a very difficult time. And this would be that we conclude ultimately that we're all members of a failed species. And during the century, we're destined to bear witness to the devastation of our planetary home and the violent unraveling of much of what we've accomplished. So that's a quotation marks because it's quoted from my book, Commanding Hope. And I ask the question, is this the story our children are going to tell themselves? I think if a substantial portion of humanity flips to this perspective on the future, then we are truly lost, because at that point, what will happen is that people will recognize that the only ones who are going to survive in this kind of future are those who are prepared to fight. And that tipping point could happen, the social and psychological tipping point could happen very quickly, and it's what we must all work very hard to prevent. So this is where hope comes in. And hope in some ways seems like a weak reed to lean upon. That it seems like a ambiguous emotion at best. And the reason my book is titled Commanding Hope is that I believe we can take this emotion of hope and shape it and make it work for us in much more powerful ways than we have to up to this point. Let me tell you, since this conference is about socially engaged research, about two examples of socially engaged people that I think give us a sense for how we can use hope in such a positive way. The first is a woman by the name of Elizabeth May. She was Stephanie May. And actually that was a slight slip. She's the mother of Elizabeth May, the recent leader of the Green Party in Canada. I'll say a little bit more of that in a moment. So Stephanie May was a housewife in Connecticut in the 1950s. She was a sculptor and a pianist, a talented person, but was raising her children, did not have a formal professional occupation at the time, but she learned that testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, this is the Bravo test by the United States of a hydrogen bomb. I think it's probably around 1954 or 55. She learned that the testing of these weapons in the atmosphere by both the United States and the Soviet Union, and they were testing hundreds of them, was contributing to a high concentration of radioactive isotopes in the atmosphere that was spreading over the entire planet. And those isotopes were landing on the surface of the planet and being bioaccumulated through being absorbed into, for instance, grasses and fields that were eaten by cows, and the cows concentrated the radioactive isotopes in their milk, which substantially raised the risk of leukemia for children all over the planet. And she read about this and started to study it, study the phenomenon and the technical details in great detail. And she decided to do something about it. But being a pre-internet time and being a housewife in a rural area of Connecticut, she didn't have access to a lot of possibilities. She began with another housewife in her community, and the two of them started a petition, originally gathering about 2,000 names from their local region. They opened up the phone book to the yellow pages and looked under the word clergy and phoned up every clergyman they could find, priest and rabbi and imam. I think there were some imams in those days, and asked those religious figures to circulate their petitions within to their parishioners and to their communities. And they managed to, over time, to gather a couple of thousand signatures, and from a number of very prominent people in their community. And they took those signatures to Washington. And to cut a long story short, over a period of years, Stephanie in particular led a process of mobilizing mothers across the United States to ban the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. It's culminated in the early 1960s with a hunger strike outside the Soviet mission in New York City. When she started it, she got no attention for days. And then all of a sudden, all the media turned up, including all the major networks, and she was interviewed and went national, and people started hunger strikes across the United States protesting the testing of nuclear weapons. Now, if you study a history of the politics and social mobilization behind the partial test ban treaty, which put nuclear weapons testing underground, signed in 1963, it turns out the mobilization of mothers around the world was a very important part of that process. Here is Stephanie in 1961 speaking to 100,000 people in Trafalgar Square in England, and that's Elizabeth May standing right beside her on the podium in front of Lord Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square in London. Stephanie had an enormous amount of influence and was, in many respects, single-handedly mobilized mothers in North America and communicated with groups around the world doing the same. And I've been told by senior arms control negotiators that the mobilization of mothers, which occurred also in the Soviet Union, made a huge difference to the eventual conclusion of the partial test ban treaty in 1963, which put testing underground, and almost immediately the concentration of nuclear isotopes in the atmosphere started to fall. I use the story throughout the book. I talk about Stephanie May at the beginning and at various intervals in the book all the way to the end, because I'm very interested in her hope, the kind of hope she expressed and how she used it within her own personal psychology and within her communication with other people to mobilize herself and to mobilize others to address this problem. And also, have to remember that during the 1950s, especially in the mid-1950s, when the hydrogen bomb was developed and was being tested by both the United States and the Soviet Union, there was a palpable sense of despair that it was as deep and encompassing as that many people feel today about the problems we're facing. There was a strong sense that a third world war, this time a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, was virtually inevitable. And Stephanie and her peers and other mothers mobilized in the face of that despair and accomplished something remarkable. Well, okay, so that was a long time ago. What about today? I want to say something about this now young woman, girl at the time, Greta Thunberg, whom we all know of well. If somebody had said on August the 18th, 2018, August the 18th, 2018, that a girl of 15 was going to sit on the steps of the Swedish Parliament building with a small sign saying "School Strike for Climate," and that she would more or less single-handedly mobilize tens, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world to demand action on climate change, with an absolutely profoundly potent moral argument to adults and especially parents around the world, saying, you had one job basically, and that was to protect us, and you failed, and we're angry, and what are you going to do about it? It was an almost unassailable moral argument. It remains an almost unassailable moral argument, and I would say that the youth mobilization around that argument, as articulated by Greta Thunberg, has fundamentally influenced global attitudes on climate change over the last 4 years. And if somebody had said that that was all going to happen on August the 18th, 2018, we would have said that's a ridiculous idea, it's impossible. And yet there she is. And this is part of what, with many other activists around the world, she accomplished. So when we look at the challenges we face and the despair that may generate within us psychologically, we have to recognize that there's this possibility, as evinced by Stephanie May and by Greta Thunberg, that we can make a huge difference on our own. Probably as individuals, we aren't going to be Stephanie Mays or Greta Thunberg and have that big an impact, but there's much we can do. And one never knows, because our world is so complex and nonlinear in its behavior these days, what small things could make a huge difference in the future, just as Stephanie May and Greta Thunberg both didn't know when they started their individual campaigns. So hope is essential for us moving forward because it gives us a sense of agency and possibility that can lead us to do socially engaged research, for example, that we hope will make a difference. But hope is a complex emotion. And in the book, I address some of the common criticisms of hope, that it's passive, naive, and false. And actually go through each one of these and in response argue that what I describe or label as commanding hope needs to be honest, astute, and powerful. I'm not going to speak about each of these characteristics today. I'll say a little bit about honesty and a little bit about where this sense of powerful agency comes from when we're thinking about hope and how to use it in our lives. And there's a deep tension between hope and honesty, especially in dangerous times. And we're now living in dangerous times. And one of the results, as I mentioned basically at the beginning of my presentation, is that we're often lying to ourselves with help from our leaders, so we can pretend it's not so bad. I love this little cartoon, which I use in the book. The poor ticket seller there for the movie An Inconvenient Truth is obviously feeling very bereft But ultimately, these lies that we tell ourselves and the denial that we engage in about the seriousness of the problems we face simply make our problems worse, because without being addressed, they get worse. And the only way we're going to address them is to start to face the truth. One of our targets for climate change, critical target, is to cap warming at 2 degrees Celsius. We're just over 1 degree, about 1.1, 1.2 degrees warming since the 19th century. At this point, international negotiators and scientists have said we need to absolutely keep warming to 2 degrees or less. But we face a fundamental challenge in trying to achieve this kind of target. And I call this the enough versus feasible dilemma. When we look at all the things we can do, complexes of wind turbines and PV solar cells, various ESG policies within companies, carbon taxes and regulations of one kind or another, the kind of thing that are being discussed, the kinds of things that are being discussed in the federal election now, and that will be on the table at the COP26 conference in Glasgow in the UK in November. On the one hand, changes that would be enough to make a real difference don't seem to be politically and socially and economically feasible. People throw up their hands and say, oh, we can't do those things. You know, we can't have a carbon tax of $170 a ton. Nobody will accept that. On the other hand, changes that are feasible, the changes that we know we can do, won't be enough. Won't be enough to keep us to a warming of 2 degrees. And that's the essence of what I call the enough versus feasible dilemma. And it's sort of summarized in this cartoon that I also reproduce in the book. It shows a woman looking out the door at a landscape on fire and saying, geez, it seems like those energy efficient light bulbs that we installed, that just wasn't enough to stop the problem. Well, it's not enough. We need ultimately to do a lot more. So we need to come to grips. Part of having an honest hope is coming to grips with the enough versus feasible dilemma, and recognizing, as Greta Thunberg says, that we need to focus first on what's enough and then try to make that feasible. So the changes we have to make in our societies are probably much more profound than most people recognize, but it also opens up a huge number of opportunities for activism, for socially engaged research, for professional possibilities going into the future, because our societies are going to be going through this very fundamental reconfiguration process. The other important part of hope that I want to emphasize today, and I'm going to speak probably just for another 5 minutes or so, is it relates to the issue of trying to make hope not just honest, but a powerful emotion within our psychologies and powerful within our communities. And this involves fundamentally moving from a passive hope that the world will be better, hope that we will keep warming to 2 degrees Celsius or less, to a more active hope to do something to achieve those ends. A hope to notion of hope always has a verb following the to. It's fundamentally an active kind of hope. Whereas a hope that, which is called, in the language of hope theorists, a dispositional notion of hope, a hope that kind of hope is very passive. It sits back and waits for good things to happen. Well, our hope has to be more intentional, as those philosophers and hope theorists would say. It needs to be a hope to kind of hope. And if it's going to be a hope to kind of hope, it needs to have a clear vision of a desirable future. We need to have a sense for where we want to go. And I spend the last part of the book trying to articulate exactly what the lineaments or the boundaries of that notion of the future should be. And I start by sort of building a floor, that this is the absolute minimum that we should accept for our future. 3 fundamental injunctions: don't wreck our planetary home, don't commit mass suicide by fighting amongst ourselves, and protect our children, which addresses, of course, Greta Thunberg's moral imperative. But those aren't enough to create a mobilizing vision of the future. And they're at best a floor and don't give us a very positive sense. So in the last chapter, I articulate 4 principles in some detail around which we should build that vision of the future. a notion of security, because at the very basis of a lot of this fear is this tremendous sense of insecurity that all these changes are producing in people. So they have to have a sense that their future is going to be one of possibility and it's going to be safe. And it needs to be a future of possibility in the sense of opportunity, especially for those people who are highly entrepreneurial and have a sense of flourishing and have a really strong sense of agency and want to build things and expand and flourish in their lives. And the notion of opportunity is fundamental for those people wherever they are in the world. Then, as we've seen in recent events and over the last 2 years, well, all of the concerns and protests surrounding systemic racism and systemic injustices, all of the changes that we're going through to respond to the climate crisis, for example, need to be grounded in a very clear notion of justice that addresses some of the profound imbalances within our societies that have led to so much of the anger and grievance that we're seeing expressed. And without addressing those injustices, we will not have the opportunity and we will not have the security that everybody desires in the future. And then finally, all of this has to be encompassed within ultimately a broader understanding of who we are, put we in quotation marks, not just in our communities and in our nation, but as a globally abundant species all over the planet. Just moving this thing here. So when we think about the challenges we face and whether there are reasons for hope, I often come back to this situation or this factor or variable of identity and the importance of it, and how that identity is going to be expressed and developed through a truly unprecedented situation that we face right now. And I think there are 3 characteristics of this situation that are truly novel in the sense that they've never really been experienced by the human species ever before on this planet. First of all, I think with the pandemic and with climate change, we have, as these problems, as I mentioned at the beginning, sweep around the planet, we have a very acute awareness of common fate now. We may be trying to deny it, we're maybe not responding to it with the proper policy tools, for instance, with a global vaccination campaign that really gets the vaccines into parts of the world that are poorer. But nonetheless, we're now realizing that increasingly that we're either going to solve these problems together or we're not going to solve them, and we're going to suffer together. At the same time, we're hyper-connected around the planet in a way that we never have been before. And that allows us to mobilize both negatively and positively, both in terms of that kind of populist nationalism I was talking about, but also in terms of global movements that draw us together in ways that haven't been possible before. And that's, of course, being this hyperconnectivity is being exploited by groups all over the planet, both good and bad, including youth mobilizing around the climate change issue, as I mentioned before. So that hyperconnectivity is new. And then we also have abundant scientific knowledge about the kind of problems we face. Knowledge that if you look back to other calamities that humankind has faced in the past, for instance, the Black Death in Europe during the 14th century, people then didn't really understand the nature of the problem and what was needed or what needed to be done to address the problem. And now we don't have that excuse anymore. We actually know exactly what the problems are, and we have a pretty good sense of what we need to do. So this combination of awareness, global awareness of common fate, global hyperconnectivity, and abundant scientific knowledge about the nature of our situation is truly new. And I think it means that we can't assume that the future is going to be simply an extension of the past in terms of how we're going to respond as a species. There's this merging sense of common fate, as I've said, a sense that we are bound together on this very small planet, all close to 8 billion of us heading towards 10 billion. And we're either going to solve these problems together or we're going to fight and die together. There really is a fundamental juxtaposition, almost an antithesis between worldviews of fear and hope. A worldview of fear, which I call a Mad Max worldview in my book, Commanding Hope, versus a much more positive worldview of hope that I unpack in some detail, which I call the Renew the Future perspective on our positive possibilities, that object for our hope, that vision of the future that can give us a sense for where we're going. This is not where we want to end up. For those of you who are aficionados of the Mad Max series, this is from Fury Road, you'll recognize it. And I think that although it's pop cinema, I think from an emotional point of view, these movies do perhaps the best job of capturing the kind of psychological and social situation that we might find ourselves in a century or so if we don't address these problems. Virtuous cascades of change start in our minds, and then they become political, as we've seen through the World Youth Climate Movement. There was a shift in perspective in many young people's minds around the world. Older generations and parents joined with them and said, "You're right, we want to help, and we're going to work with you to change these policies and the politics around climate change." And then that mobilization has had political impacts all over the planet. So that's a tipping point phenomenon. And I think there are going to be many tipping points in the future, perhaps pernicious ones emerging from the climate as our climate reorganizes itself in response to its warming, all the extra accumulated energy within it. But also I think that there are real possibilities for positive social tipping points. If we can focus on these emerging realities of shared fate and work together with a common encompassing sense of we-ness to address our problems. And within that process, there's a role for each and every one of us to look for those niches and those possibilities for change, which one never knows might end up changing the world. So thank you very much. We have a few minutes, I guess, for questions at this point. Questions and discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. After 2 days of presentations on socially engaged research and social change, I'm inspired to continue to create change. But honestly, I'm also tired. I think my resilience isn't what it used to be. And I think one of the great things about hope, like many emotions, is that it's, unlimited and an entirely renewable resource. But how do we recharge our hope? How do we tap back into our hope after, so many of the things that you mentioned at the beginning? So I'll leave that question and then turn it over to you to manage other participant questions.
So I imagine the questions are going to turn up in the chat box. Is that correct?
They can either raise their hand, in which case I'll see that, or they can put it in the chat box, whatever works for you.
So, Robert, let me answer your question. It's an issue I think we all struggle with on a daily basis. I mean, I struggle with it every single day because I'm deeply enmeshed in this climate research and climate literature, and I'm following, of course, the literature on many of these other problems simultaneously. And it is kind of a polycrisis. In fact, I'm writing an article with some German scientists right now about this emerging polycrisis where everything seems to be combining simultaneously. But, I guess part of what, this is me speaking as a parent, part of what recharges me on a daily basis is looking at my kids and saying, it is simply unacceptable to give up, right? And the other thing, another part of it is that there are so many opportunities on a daily basis for joy and for gratitude and what we're experiencing and what we have in our lives, that is a place where you can return, and that provides me with some opportunity to recharge and then to re-enter into the battle. But you have to withdraw on some occasions and just say, okay, I can't think about this for the time being. and go to those moments of joy, which might be a rainbow or a sunset or a smile on somebody you love's face, or a really good meal, or a wonderful conversation with friends, or something like that. So I find those are places where I can recharge and then return. It helps build resilience. And then a third thing I would say is that, and I alluded to this in my talk, but it's really important. We don't know enough, and I make this point throughout my book, we don't know enough about how these systems around us operate to know that there's no opportunity for amazing positive change in the future, right? And that's the point of the Greta Thunberg story. If somebody had said that that was going to happen on August the 18th, 2018, we would have said, oh, that's ridiculous. And then it happened. These are possibilities that are just beyond the boundary of what complexity scientists call the adjacent possible, just slightly outside our reality. And Greta Thunberg took one of those and pulled it into reality. And there may be other possibilities there. So the world is too complex to know that it's game over. We're a long way from game over yet. In fact, it's quite possible that this is a process that humanity has to go through to grow up. Mm-hmm. In many respects, we're behaving like adolescents. You know, we think we're invulnerable. We're trashing the house. We're not thinking about the future at all. Our time horizons are really short, and we're having a great party. And now we actually have to develop some wisdom as a species. We have to pull together as a species. And I think that it may be, and I tell my kids this may be one of the most exciting times to be alive, because it's all on the table right now. Everything's at stake, and there's some really big moral issues we have to address, and that's important.
It looks like we do have some questions and some hands being raised. I'm going to go to Jen Bruce first.
Hi, great presentation, super interesting. I just had a question. So your examples of, Greta Thunberg and Elizabeth May's mother, Stephanie May, Elizabeth May's mother, that's all I can think of. I mean, not everyone is going to initiate powerful social movements such as they have done, but have you seen in your work or just your own experience examples of really powerful and impactful kind of actions of just individuals aligning their daily lives with kind of what that idea of hope and what they want to see for the future, like just to kind of bring it down a little bit more granular than initiating a social movement?
Yeah, no, but you have to remember, Jen, as I said during my presentation, that neither Stephanie nor Greta had any conception that they were going to accomplish what they did when they started, right? They just thought this was going to be granular. They thought, oh, well, I have to do something. I'm going to sit here on the steps of the Parliament building because I'm feeling that this is an impossible situation and I have to say something. And Stephanie, and I was able to read her unpublished memoirs and look at their scrapbooks of all the correspondence she had with people. She had no conception that she was going to accomplish what she did. Now, I think, without laying my cards too clearly on the table, I happen to, for instance, support the protests against old growth logging here on the West Coast. My dad was a forester. I grew up in the woods. I know about logging. I was a timber cruiser, put myself through university as a timber cruiser surveying for logging companies. So it's an industry I know about and I respect. But there is no reason to be logging old growth forest on the West Coast anymore. And that's granular and it's hard. And yet, already significant areas of old growth in the Fairy Creek area have been protected. And these folks are not making this issue go away. They're keeping this issue right in the center of political discourse in British Columbia. It's not the case that everybody wants to engage in that kind of thing. But I know people, for instance, who are working on, one example is an entrepreneur I know in Ontario who's working on a new transmission for electric vehicles that can increase the efficiency of electric vehicles by about 20 20%. I went to his research facility in Northern Toronto a while ago, and it's an amazing piece of technology. There are people who are working, of course, at the community level around social issues, housing, better racial relations, for example. All of that stuff makes a difference. In fact, in many cases, all of that stuff has to happen before you can have the social flip that you get sometimes further down the road. One of the examples I use in my book is the peaceful democratic transition in South Africa. I traveled in South Africa during hitchhiked all over the country with a friend during the heyday of the apartheid regime. Nobody at that time thought that there would be a peaceful democratic transition to a multiracial society, and yet it occurred. But that was the result, to a significant extent, of an enormous amount of work that was being done by civil society and groups all across the society to build the platform for that normative and institutional shift that Mandela and de Klerk could both build upon when they decided that that was the pathway they wanted to take. But when I traveled in that country in the early 1980s, everybody thought that a racial bloodbath was virtually inevitable. So I think whether it's large or small, we can all play a role, and one never knows. And this is why the stories of Greta and Stephanie are so important. One never knows whether what one is doing might turn out to be huge and world changing, because neither of them did at the time either.
Thank you very much. We're gonna have one more question. And Tad, if you could keep it to just a couple minutes, that would be great. Turn it over to Bill. Bill Holmes, go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Tad. Fascinating presentation. Tad, you talked about the importance of we and working together as a species to solve these problems. And then Rob talked about the sort of level of exhaustion that many of us are feeling. And I wanted to ask you about the sort of us and them phenomena, the politicization of things like the pandemic, where, part of my frustration is all those people out there that, anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, climate change deniers. We have this sort of us and them thing develop where we feel like we get it, but there's a huge group of people that don't want to give up what they perceive to be the freedoms they've earned, like the freedom to pollute, the freedom to not wear masks, the freedom to go unvaccinated. And so how do we solve that divide? How do we get over this politicization of the positive moves that need to ensure our future?
Yes, wonderful question, Bill. So I think that the odds are, if you want my honest appreciation or assessment of this, is that we won't, right? That because in the past, under these similar sorts of circumstances, people have ended up deeply divided and in terrible conflicts with each other. Now, I think that those differences I highlighted, the emerging sense of shared fate, the hyperconnectivity, and the scientific knowledge could be sufficient to tip us in a different direction into a really new pathway of human social development. But there's a very, very strong possibility we're going to end up in a kind of Mad Max world. Now, but nonetheless, I think that there is a sufficient possibility, in my view, that we won't, that it's a real grounding and source of hope, and that we need to aim for that. And that has to be part of our object of the future, our vision of the future that we're going to aim for, that will give us a sense of powerful possibility, the powerful hope I was talking about. But I skipped over astute hope, which was the third element of commanding hope that I have built within the book. There's honest hope. I talked a bit about that, making sure that we face the enough versus feasible dilemma directly on. There's powerful hope, which is grounded in a sense of what the vision of the future is, gives us a sense of agency. But there's also this notion of astute hope and being acutely aware of the time, Rob. I'll just say just a word or two about that. This is a kind of hope that is very well informed about the way other people we're dealing with look at the world. So it gives us a very strong sense of strategic possibility in working with those people, whether we can build bridges to them, whether we can't and simply have to try to work around them as obstacles in one way or the other. So I introduced in the book a number of tools, very practical tools that people can use to get a better sense for who they're dealing with and how they look at the world and the environment. And in other words, to try to address some of those conflicts and polarizations. Now, some of the polarization we won't be able to deal with and won't be able to address, but in many cases, there are people we can reach. There are justifiable concerns many of these groups have that you alluded to. Well, you said, the right to pollute, but there are deep concerns about liberty and state intrusion and confiscation of property that, when stated in reasonable terms, sounds entirely acceptable to all of us. And there are possibilities for bridging those divides that I think are not expressed. Now, we're not going to be able to do that with all these folks, but astute hope is very much grounded in a much more acute awareness of who we're dealing with in our strategic environment as we're trying to mobilize and change the direction of our societies. I think, just to speak to the pandemic and climate change very briefly, we have very vocal minorities here that consist of 10 to 20% of the population, at least in Canada, on both the climate and the COVID vaccination issues that are very resistant. But the majority of people across the country recognize that climate change is a problem, want to do something about it, and support quite aggressive policies in response, even policies that will cost them a lot of money. And the majority recognize the pandemic as a problem, recognize vaccines are the first way of responding to it effectively, and are prepared to follow the recommendations of public health authorities to try to put us in a better place with respect to the pandemic. So we mustn't overemphasize too much a minority who nonetheless can cause a lot of trouble. But I think there are possibilities through this kind of astute awareness of reaching out to at least a substantial subsection of those minorities and bringing them into that broader conception of the we. And that's the source of my astute hope anyway.
Thank you very much.